The city of Antioch is located on the Orontes River, around 12 miles from the Mediterranean coast. It was established in 300 BC by Seleucus I of Syria, who named it in honor of his father. Antioch quickly grew in prominence, becoming the leading city in Asia, and during the Roman Empire, it ranked as the third most important city in the world. For Christians, it held special significance as the place where the followers of Christ were first called Christians, and where St. Peter established his first bishopric. By the 6th century AD, Antioch's glory had begun to fade due to a series of devastating earthquakes and a raid by the Persians. Its decline continued after the Arab conquest, which allowed the inland city of Aleppo to rise at its expense. The Byzantines regained control of Antioch in the 10th century, restoring some of its former prestige. It became a key center for trade between the Greeks and Muslims and emerged as the most formidable stronghold on the Syrian frontier. In 1085, the city fell to Suleiman ibn Kutalmish. After his death, control passed to Sultan Malik Shah, who appointed the Turkoman leader Yaghi-Siyan as governor. Yaghi-Siyan had ruled Antioch for 10 years. Although he was nominally under the authority of Emir Ridwan of Aleppo following Malik Shah's death, he largely maintained his independence by playing Ridwan off against his rivals, Dukak of Damascus and Kerboga of Mosul. In 1096, Yaghi-Siyan even betrayed Ridwan during a conflict with Dukak, whom he then acknowledged as his superior. The news of the Crusaders' approach deeply unsettled Yaghi-Siyan. Antioch was their clear target, and the Crusaders could not move south toward Palestine without first securing the city. The majority of Antioch's inhabitants were Christians, while the Syrian Christians, who distrusted both Greeks and Armenians, might have remained loyal. Yaghi-Siyan could not rely on the others. Until this time, he had shown tolerance toward the Christian population. The Orthodox Patriarch, John the Oxite, had been allowed to remain in the city, and its large churches had not been converted into mosques. However, as the crusade drew closer, Yaghi-Siyan began to implement repressive policies. He imprisoned the Patriarch, the most prominent religious figure in Antioch. Many influential Christians were expelled, and others fled. The Cathedral of St. Peter was desecrated and turned into stables for the emir's horses. In nearby villages, persecution increased, and this led to local Christian villagers massacring Turkish garrisons as soon as the Crusaders appeared. Yaghi-Siyan then began seeking allies. Ridwan of Aleppo refused to help, but Dukak of Damascus responded positively after Yaghi-Siyan's son, Shams ad-Dawla, made a personal appeal. Dukak's Atabeg, the Turkoman leader Token, and the emir Jana ad-Dawla of Homs also pledged their support. Another envoy was sent to Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul, who had become the most powerful ruler in Upper Mesopotamia and the Jazeera. Kerboga recognized the danger the Crusaders posed to the Muslim world and had ambitions of his own. Capturing Antioch would put Ridwan at his mercy. He began organizing an army to relieve the city and received backing from the sultans of Baghdad and Persia. In the meantime, Yaghi-Siyan gathered a substantial force inside Antioch and began stockpiling supplies to withstand a prolonged siege. The Crusaders entered Yaghi-Siyan's domain at the small town of Marata, where the Turkish garrison fled at the sight of their approach. From there, a force led by Robert of Flanders was dispatched southwest to liberate the town of Arda, whose Christian inhabitants had already killed the garrison station there. Meanwhile, on October 20th, the main army reached the banks of the Orontes River at the Iron Bridge, a key crossing where the roads from Marash and Aleppo converged. The bridge was well defended, flanked by 2 towers at its entrance. Despite this, the Crusaders launched an immediate assault. The Bishop of Lupui directed the operation, and after a fierce clash, they successfully stormed the bridge. Their victory allowed them to seize a massive convoy carrying cattle, sheep, and grain, all intended to supply Yaghi-Siyan's forces. With the way now clear, the Crusaders could see Antioch's formidable citadel rising in the distance. The next day, Bohemond led the vanguard to the city walls, with the rest of the army close behind. The sight of Antioch left the Crusaders in awe. The city's houses and markets sprawled across a plain nearly 3 miles long and 1 mile wide, nestled between the Orontes River and Mount Silpius. Wealthy estates and palaces were scattered across the hillside. Surrounding it all were immense fortifications originally built under Emperor Justinian and recently reinforced by the Byzantines with the most advanced engineering techniques of their time. To the north, the walls rose from marshy ground near the river, while to the east and west they climbed steep slopes of the mountain. On the southern side, the walls ran along the summit of the ridge, spanning a deep gorge carved by the Anopnicles torrent, then crossing a narrow passage known as the Iron Gate, and finally reaching their peak at a majestic citadel towering 1,000 feet above the city. The walls were punctuated by 400 towers, carefully spaced so that every part could be reached by archers. The northeastern gate of St. Paul opened toward the road from the Iron Bridge and Aleppo, while the gate of St. George in the northwest provided access to the road from Laodike and the Lebanese coast. Roads to Alexandretta and the port of St. Simeon, modern-day Swadai, exited the city via a large gate by the river, crossing a fortified bridge. Smaller gates like the Gate of the Duke and the Gate of the Dog offered routes to the river farther east. Inside the city walls, there was a reliable water supply, along with market gardens and pastures for livestock. The space was large enough to house an entire army and sustain it through a prolonged siege. Surrounding the entire city was impossible, as the rugged, steep terrain to the south was too treacherous for any troops to occupy. The Turks had originally captured Antioch in 1085 through betrayal, and it was this same threat of treachery that now haunted Yaghi-Siyan. Though the Crusaders could not completely encircle the city, he lacked enough men to defend every section of the vast walls. Until reinforcements arrived, he could not afford to lose any soldiers. Cautious and uncertain, he made no move to challenge the Crusaders as they took up their positions, and for 2 weeks he refrained from engaging them at all. Upon their arrival, the Crusaders positioned themselves outside the northeastern corner of Antioch's walls. Bohemond established his camp opposite the Gate of St. Paul. Raymond set up across from the Gate of the Dog, and Godfrey stationed himself to Raymond's right, facing the Gate of the Duke. The remaining forces stayed behind Bohemond, ready to move forward wherever needed. At this stage, the Bridge Gate and the Gate of St. George remained unguarded. Almost immediately, the Crusaders began constructing a bridge of boats to span the river from Godfrey's position to the village of Tolenki, where the Muslim cemetery was located. This crossing gave them access to the roads leading to Alexandretta and St. Simeon, and they quickly established a camp north of the river. Yaghi-Siyan had anticipated a swift assault on the city. However, among the Crusader leaders, only Raymond argued for an immediate attack on the walls. He believed that the same divine protection that had brought them this far would also grant them victory. But the others did not share his conviction. The city's massive fortifications were intimidating, their soldiers were exhausted, and the risk of sustaining heavy losses was too great. Moreover, they believed reinforcements would soon arrive. There were even rumors of a Genoese fleet approaching. Bohemond, whose opinions carried the most influence, had personal motivations for opposing Raymond's proposal. He was already envisioning Antioch as his own domain. Not only did he want to avoid seeing the city ransacked by a plundering army, but he also feared that if Antioch were captured through a collective effort, he would be unable to make an exclusive claim to it. He had learned a valuable lesson at Nicaea from Alexius. If the city could be made to surrender directly to him, his claim would be much harder to contest. He believed he could soon arrange this outcome, being somewhat familiar with the art of Eastern intrigue. Under his sway, Raymond's advice was dismissed, deepening the hostility between the two leaders. And so, the best opportunity to quickly seize Antioch was lost. Had the Crusaders launched a successful early assault, Yaghi-Siyan, already on edge, might have mounted little resistance. The delay, however, allowed him to regain his composure. Bohemond and his allies found it easy to establish communication with those inside the city. Christian refugees and exiles maintained regular contact with relatives within Antioch, taking advantage of the gaps in both the Crusader blockade and the city's defenses. As a result, the Crusaders remained well informed about events unfolding inside the walls. But this flow of information went both ways. Many local Christians were ambivalent about whether Byzantine or Frankish rule would be better than Turkish rule. To secure favor with Yaghi-Siyan, some provided him with detailed intelligence on the Crusaders' activities. It was through these informants that Yaghi-Siyan learned of the Crusaders' hesitation to attack. Encouraged by this knowledge, he began organizing sorties. His troops would slip out of the western gate to ambush isolated groups of Frankish foragers. He also coordinated with his forces stationed in Harenk, located across the Iron Bridge on the road to Aleppo, urging them to launch attacks on the Crusader rear lines. Around this time, he received word that his son's diplomatic mission to Damascus had been successful. As autumn gave way to winter, the Crusaders began to lose morale, despite achieving a few small victories. In mid-November, Bohemond led an expedition that successfully lured the garrison of Harenk out of their fortress and annihilated them. Around the same time, a Genoese fleet of 13 ships arrived at the port of St. Simeon, which the Crusaders were then able to occupy. The fleet brought additional troops and weapons, responding belatedly to Pope Urban's earlier call to the city of Genoa, made nearly 2 years prior. This development reassured the Crusaders, as they now had a secure line of communication with their homelands by sea. However, these triumphs were soon eclipsed by the growing crisis of food shortages. When the Crusaders first reached the plains surrounding Antioch, they found the area well supplied. Livestock such as sheep and cattle were abundant, and many village granaries still held the recent harvest. With plenty available, they failed to stockpile provisions for the colder months ahead. As supplies dwindled, foraging parties had to travel further afield, exposing themselves to ambushes by Turkish forces descending from the nearby mountains. It was discovered that Turkish raiders were using the Anopnikals Gorge to secretly reach a vantage point above Bohemond's camp, where they would ambush Crusaders returning late. In response, the leaders agreed to construct a fortified tower on the hill, which each commander would take turns manning. The tower was soon completed and given the name Mauergard. By Christmas, the army's food stores were nearly depleted, and the surrounding countryside had been stripped bare. A council of princes decided to dispatch part of the army under Bohemond and Robert of Flanders to raid villages further up the Orontes Valley near Hama, hoping to seize any remaining supplies. Raymond and the Bishop of Lupuy were left in charge of maintaining the siege. Godfrey was too ill at the time to participate. On December 28th, Bohemond and Robert departed with approximately 20,000 men. Yaghi-Siyan was quickly informed of their movement. Waiting until the force was well out of range, he launched a surprise sortie on the night of December 29th. His troops crossed the bridge and attacked the Crusaders encamped on the north side of the river. The attack took them by surprise, but Raymond reacted swiftly. Gathering a group of knights, he launched a countercharge from the darkness, catching the Turks off guard and forcing them to retreat across the bridge. Raymond pursued them so aggressively that his troops briefly secured a foothold on the other side before the city gates could be closed. At that moment, it seemed Raymond might prove his belief that Antioch could be taken by force. However, a riderless horse, panicked and running wild, plunged into the tightly packed knights on the bridge, throwing their ranks into confusion. In the darkness, chaos spread quickly, and panic set in among the Crusaders. They fled back toward their camp by the boat bridge, with the Turks now chasing them in turn. Eventually, the Crusaders regrouped, and the Turkish forces withdrew to the safety of the city. The skirmish resulted in heavy casualties on both sides, but the losses were particularly severe among the Frankish knights. Among the fallen was the standard-bearer of Edhemer himself. Meanwhile, Bohemond was traveling south with Robert of Flanders, completely unaware of how close Raymond had come to capturing Antioch. Around mid-December, Dukak of Damascus had departed his capital with his Atabeg Token, Yaghi-Siyan's son Shams, and a sizable army. At Hama, they were joined by the local emir and his troops. By December 30th, they had reached Shazer, where they learned that a Crusader force was nearby. They advanced immediately and the following morning encountered the enemy at the village of Albara. The Crusaders were caught off guard. Robert's forces, slightly ahead of Bohemond's, were nearly encircled. But Bohemond, recognizing the unfolding danger, held most of his troops in reserve and launched a counterattack, just as the Muslims believed they had secured victory. His timely assault rescued Robert and dealt such heavy casualties to Dukak's army that it was forced to retreat back to Hama. Despite claiming victory and having successfully prevented the relief of Antioch, the Crusaders were themselves too weakened to continue foraging. After plundering a few villages and setting a mosque ablaze, they returned to the siege camp nearly empty-handed. Upon their return, they found the camp in a state of despair. The failed battle on the night of the 29th had been followed the next day by a strong earthquake, felt as far away as Edessa, and that evening the sky lit up with the northern lights. In the weeks that followed, torrential rain fell continuously, and the temperatures dropped steadily. Stephen of Blois expressed disbelief that anyone had ever complained about too much sun in Syria. To many, it seemed as though divine wrath had descended upon them. Adhemer of Lupuy declared a 3-day fast as a form of penance, but with famine looming, the fast had little practical effect. The failed foraging mission now meant mass starvation. Soon, 1 out of every 7 men was dying from hunger. Desperate for food, envoys were sent as far as the Taurus Mountains, where the Rupenian princes agreed to offer what little they could. Some aid also came from Armenian monks living in the Amanus Mountains, and local Armenian and Syrian Christians gathered whatever edible supplies they could find to bring to the Crusaders' camp. However, this assistance was driven by profit rather than charity. A single donkey load of food could cost as much as 8 bezants. The horses fared even worse than the men, and by this point, only about 700 remained with the army. A more generous source of support came from the island of Cyprus. Acting likely under Pope Urban's guidance, the Bishop of Lupuy had been diligent in cultivating good relations with the leaders of the Eastern Orthodox Church, showing them a level of respect that contradicts the idea that the Pope intended to dominate them through the crusade. For the imprisoned Patriarch of Antioch, locked inside the city, such gestures were of little comfort, as the Turks occasionally placed him in a cage and suspended him over the city walls. But the Patriarch Simeon of Jerusalem, who had fled his position after Ortok's death rendered his city unsafe, was now living in Cyprus. Once communication lines were opened, Adhemer reached out to Simeon. Although Simeon opposed Latin customs, he was willing to cooperate with the Western Church for the greater good of Christendom. Back in October, he had already joined Adhemer in sending a report on the crusade to Western Christians. Now, upon hearing of the Crusaders' desperate condition, he began regularly sending all the food and wine Cyprus could spare across the sea to aid the army. Despite the generosity of the Patriarch's food shipments, they were not enough to ease the widespread suffering. As hunger intensified, many soldiers began to abandon the camp, either heading toward wealthier regions in search of relief or attempting the long journey home. Initially, only lower-ranking soldiers deserted. But one morning in January, it was discovered that Peter the hermit himself had fled. William was known to be an opportunist, uninterested in enduring a failing cause. He had already deserted a military venture in Spain. But Peter's loss of courage is more difficult to explain. The 2 fugitives were soon pursued and captured by Tancred, who returned them in disgrace. Peter, whose reputation was too valuable to jeopardize, was quietly forgiven. William, on the other hand, was made to stand all night in Bohemond's tent and, come morning, was subjected to a stern and threatening reprimand. He swore never to abandon the army again until it reached Jerusalem. With the army shrinking daily due to starvation and desertion, Adhemer determined that a powerful plea for reinforcements must be sent to the west. To lend it the greatest authority, he wrote the appeal in the name of the Patriarch of Jerusalem, whose approval he had presumably secured. The wording of the letter is notable, as it reflects Adhemer's broader approach to church politics. In the letter, the Patriarch speaks to the faithful in the West as the head of all bishops now active in the East. He refers to himself as apostolic, and takes the bold step of excommunicating any Christian who breaks their crusading vows. The tone is that of an autonomous religious leader. It would have been impossible for Edhemer to put such words into the mouth of someone intended to be subordinate to the Pope. Regardless of what Urban's long-term vision might have been for the Eastern churches, his legate was clearly not advocating for direct papal dominance. What kind of response the Patriarch's letter received in the West remains unknown. While the Crusaders maintained respectful relations with the Eastern Orthodox Church leaders, their dealings with the political authority of Byzantium began to deteriorate. In early February, the emperor's envoy, Titius, unexpectedly departed from the Crusader camp. He had been accompanying the Crusades since Nicaea, bringing along a small staff and a group primarily made up of engineers and guides. Relations with the Crusader leaders had appeared cordial, and he had been entrusted with control over captured cities at Comana and Coxen, acknowledging their military prowess in his reports. Various explanations circulated for his departure, but there is no need to dismiss the account he gave upon returning to Constantinople. According to Titius, Bohemond had summoned him privately once word spread that another Turkish attempt to relieve Antioch was imminent. Bohemond warned him, in confidence, that the other Crusade leaders suspected the emperor of aiding the Turks and were plotting to assassinate Titius in retaliation. Convinced by this warning, and sensing that the army was in no position to capture the fortress, Titius decided to withdraw. His recommendation to starve out Antioch by occupying the surrounding castles had been disregarded. Declaring he needed to return to imperial lands to improve supply logistics, he set sail for Cyprus from the port of St. Simeon. To imply his intention to return, he left most of his staff with the army. But once gone, Bohemond supporters began spreading the rumor that Titius had fled out of cowardice in the face of the Turkish threat. If the emperor's representative had abandoned them so dishonorably, then, they argued, the Crusaders were no longer bound to return Antioch to the empire. Shortly thereafter, Bohemond began hinting that he, too, might leave the army. He claimed that he could no longer ignore his obligations in Italy. Until now, he had played a central role in nearly every military operation, and the thought of losing him during such a critical phase caused considerable alarm within the ranks. He subtly let it be known that being granted control over Antioch would compensate for the sacrifices he was making by remaining. While the other princes saw through his maneuvering, many common soldiers were moved by his apparent sincerity. Meanwhile, Turkish forces were gathering once more to relieve Antioch. When Dukat failed to deliver the promised support, Yaghi-Siyan turned again to his former overlord, Ridwan of Aleppo. Regretting his earlier inaction, which had allowed the Crusaders to reach Antioch, Ridwan renewed his alliance with Yaghi-Siyan and began organizing a rescue operation. He was joined by his cousin, Sakman the Ortakid of Diyarbakir, and his father-in-law, the Emir of Hama. In early February, the allied Muslim forces reoccupied Harank, using it as their staging ground for an attack on the Crusader encampment. Upon hearing this, the Crusader princes convened in Edhemer's tent, where Bohemond proposed a bold strategy. The infantry would remain behind to guard against any sorties from Antioch, while the remaining knights would launch a surprise attack on the advancing Turks. The plan was approved. On the evening of February 8th, the Frankish cavalry crossed the bridge of boats and positioned themselves between the Orontes River and Lake Antioch, ready to ambush the enemy as they approached the iron bridge. At dawn, the Turkish army came into view. The Crusader cavalry launched their first assault before the Turkish archers could organize. Although the initial charge did not break the Turkish formation, the knights withdrew strategically, drawing the enemy toward a narrow strip of land bordered by the lake on one side and the river on the other. This terrain prevented the Turks from using their superior numbers to outflank the Crusaders. There, the knights launched a second, full-force charge. This time, their heavier armor and disciplined formation overwhelmed the more lightly equipped Turks. Chaos spread quickly through the Turkish ranks, and Ridwan's entire army collapsed into retreat, fleeing back toward Aleppo. As the retreating soldiers passed through Harank, the garrison there also abandoned the town, which was promptly turned over by the local Christian population to the Crusaders. While the cavalry was securing a dramatic victory, the infantry faced a much tougher challenge. Yaghi-Siyan launched a full-scale sortie against the Crusader camp, and the defenders began to falter. However, in the afternoon, the triumphant knights were seen approaching from a distance. As they drew near, Yaghi-Siyan realized that the relief army had been defeated. He quickly ordered his troops to retreat back within the city walls. Although the defeat of the second relief force boosted Crusader morale, it did little to improve their dire situation. Food remained scarce, despite some supplies now arriving at the port of St. Simeon, mostly from Cyprus. Yet, the road to the coast was frequently targeted by raiders emerging from Antioch, who ambushed small supply convoys. At the same time, Antioch continued to receive provisions via the still unblocked gate of St. George and across the fortified bridge. To secure the bridge and ensure safe passage to St. Simeon, Raymond proposed the construction of a tower on the northern bank nearby. However, the plan stalled due to a shortage of building materials and skilled labor. Then, on March 4th, a fleet manned by English sailors arrived at St. Simeon, commanded by the exiled English Prince Edgar Atheling. The fleet had picked up pilgrims from Italy and had stopped in Constantinople, where Edgar joined them under the authority of the emperor. There, the ships had been loaded with siege equipment and craftsmen. Yet, the Crusaders were careful to ignore the fact that these vital reinforcements had been sent by the emperor. Upon hearing of the fleet's arrival, Raymond and Bohemond decided to travel to the port together to recruit as many fighters as possible and escort the mechanics and supplies back to camp. On March 6th, as they were making their return journey along the road from St. Simeon, they were ambushed by a detachment from the city's garrison. Their forces, caught off guard, panicked and fled, abandoning their cargo to the enemy. A few survivors managed to reach the camp and spread the alarming news that Raymond and Bohemond had been killed. Godfrey, preparing to go out in response, was suddenly faced with a sortie from Antioch. The Turks attacked the camp to provide cover for their returning ambushers, now burdened with stolen supplies. Fortunately, Godfrey's troops were already armed and ready to march toward the coast, allowing them to hold the assault until Raymond and Bohemond, battered but alive, returned with what remained of their troops. Their unexpected arrival, though diminished in strength, gave Godfrey the reinforcements needed to repel the attackers. The leaders then coordinated an effort to intercept the retreating raiders. Their strategy worked perfectly. Laden with plunder, the raiders were quickly outmaneuvered and cut down as they tried to reach the bridge. The valuable construction materials were recovered. It was reported that around 1,500 Turks were killed, many of them drowning while trying to cross the river. Among the dead were 9 emirs. That night, members of the garrison crept out to bury the fallen in the Muslim cemetery on the river's north bank. The Crusaders allowed them to proceed undisturbed. The Crusaders' recent victory enabled them to fully tighten the blockade around Antioch. With the arrival of construction workers and materials, they proceeded to erect a fortress to control access to the fortified bridge. This new stronghold was built near a mosque adjacent to the Muslim cemetery and was formally named the Castle of La Muhammadi, derived from the Old French word for mosque. However, during deliberations over who would command it, Raymond, who had originally proposed its construction, claimed authority over it. As a result, the structure was commonly referred to as Raymond's Castle. Completed by March 19th, it quickly proved effective in cutting off movement through the bridge gate. Nonetheless, the gate of St. George remained unblocked. To address this, the Crusaders resolved to build another castle on a hill opposite the gate, on the site of a former convent. This second fortress was finished in April and entrusted to Tancred, who was granted 300 marks to cover his costs. From that point onward, no food convoys could reach the city, nor could its citizens drive their livestock outside the walls as they had previously done. While small raiding parties could still scale Mount Silpius or slip through the narrow iron gate, large-scale sorties were no longer possible. As hunger began to afflict the city's garrison, the Crusaders saw an improvement in their own supply situation. With the arrival of spring, better weather allowed for safer foraging. Merchants now turned to trade with the Crusader camp, making more food available and lifting the army's morale. Not long after his fortress was completed, Tancred intercepted a large shipment of provisions intended for Yaghi-Siyan, transported by Christian merchants, both Syrian and Armenian. Victories like these gave the Crusaders hope that they could force Antioch into submission through starvation. But they knew time was short, as the fearsome Kerboga of Mosul was assembling his forces. Back in Constantinople, Emperor Alexius had advised the Crusaders to seek some form of agreement with the Fatimids of Egypt. The Fatimids were staunch enemies of the Turks, maintained a relatively tolerant stance toward Christians, and had a history of negotiating with Christian powers. Although the Crusaders likely ignored this advice at the time, an Egyptian delegation arrived at their camp outside Antioch in early spring, sent by Al-Afdal. The Egyptian envoy's proposal appeared to involve a partition of the Seljuk Empire. The Crusaders would take northern Syria, while Egypt would claim Palestine. Al-Afdal, probably viewing the Crusaders as imperial mercenaries, assumed they would agree to such a division, which reflected the territorial boundaries before the Turkish invasions. The Western leaders welcomed the delegation cordially, but refrained from making any firm commitments. The Egyptians stayed in the camp for several weeks before returning home, accompanied by a small Crusader delegation and bearing generous gifts, mostly spoils from the battle, on March 6th. These interactions revealed to the Crusaders the potential benefits of playing Muslim factions against each other. Setting aside their religious animosities, they next reached out to Dukak of Damascus upon hearing of Kerboga's mobilization. They requested his neutrality and assured him they had no intentions toward his lands. But Dukak, who viewed his brother Ridwan of Aleppo as his primary rival and had observed Ridwan's return to his stance of neutrality, ultimately declined to support their request. By early May, news reached the Crusaders that Kerboga was advancing. His forces included not only his own men, but also troops contributed by the sultans of Baghdad and Persia, along with contingents from the Ortakid princes of northern Mesopotamia. Dukak of Damascus was poised to join him, and in Antioch, Yaghi-Siyan, though under intense pressure, continued to hold out. Tensions within the Crusader camp mounted. They understood clearly that unless they captured the city before Kerboga arrived, they risked being caught between the city's garrison and a massive relief army. Emperor Alexius was engaged in military operations in Asia Minor, and a desperate appeal was dispatched urging him to come to their aid swiftly. Bohemond, who was determined to claim Antioch for himself, had particular reason to be anxious. Should the emperor arrive before the city fell, or if Kerboga was only defeated with imperial assistance, Bohemond would have no choice but to relinquish Antioch back to Byzantine control. While most of the Crusader leaders were willing to concede the city to Bohemond, Raymond of Toulouse resisted this outcome. The reasons behind Raymond's stance have been widely debated. He was the only prince not formally bound by an oath to the emperor, yet he had left Constantinople on amicable terms with him. More importantly, he deeply distrusted and disliked Bohemond, viewing him as his principal rival for command of the crusade. Raymond and the papal legate Adhemer may also have believed that if the oaths to the emperor were no longer valid, then only the church had the authority to distribute conquered lands. After much negotiation and political maneuvering, a compromise was reached. If Bohemond's forces were the first to enter the city, and if the emperor failed to arrive, he would be granted Antioch. Even with this agreement, Raymond hesitated to fully support it, though Bohemond already felt confident he was on the path to victory. Kerboga's own strategic error gave the Crusaders valuable time. He hesitated to advance on Antioch while a Frankish army remained in Edessa, potentially threatening his right flank. He failed to realize that although Baldwin was too weak to launch an offensive, he was well entrenched in his fortress and not easily dislodged. Kerboga spent the last 3 weeks of May futilely assaulting Edessa's walls, eventually abandoning the effort as not worth the cost or delay. Bohemond used this unexpected pause to full advantage. During this time, he established a secret connection with a captain inside Antioch named Firas. Firas, believed to be an Armenian convert to Islam, had gained a high position within Yaghi-Siyan's administration. Despite his apparent loyalty, Pyrrhus harbored resentment toward his commander, who had recently fined him for hoarding grain. Maintaining contact with fellow Christians inside the city, Pyrrhus eventually reached an agreement with Bohemond to betray Antioch in exchange for a price. The plan was kept completely confidential. Bohemond shared nothing of it with his peers, choosing instead to publicly highlight the dangers facing the army. By amplifying the sense of peril, he increased the dramatic value of the triumph he was quietly arranging. Bohemond's campaign of persuasion worked all too well. By the end of May, Kerboga had abandoned his fruitless assault on Edessa and resumed his march toward Antioch. As his army approached, panic gripped the Crusader camp. Deserters began to leave in such large numbers that any effort to halt them proved futile. Finally, on June 2nd, a sizable group of northern French troops fled toward Alexandretta, led by Stephen of Blois. Just 2 months earlier, Stephen had written confidently to his wife from the Crusader encampment, describing both the hardships of the siege and the celebrated victory of March 6th, proudly highlighting his own role in the campaign. But now, with Antioch still untaken and Kerboga's forces closing in, he saw staying as a death sentence. Known more for diplomacy than military prowess, Stephen decided to leave while he still could. Among all the princes, Stephen had been the most vocal in his admiration for the Byzantine emperor. Bohemond likely took quiet satisfaction in seeing him go. What he couldn't predict, however, was how Stephen's departure would soon work in his favor. Had Stephen delayed his escape just a few hours, he may have made a different choice. That very day, Pyrrhus sent word through his son that he was ready to commit his act of betrayal. Rumors would later claim that Pyrrhus had wavered until the night before, when he learned his wife had been unfaithful with a Turkish colleague. Pyrrhus now held command over the Tower of the Two Sisters and the adjacent section of the city wall, directly across from Tancred's position. He urged Bohemond to stage a diversion, assemble the army in the afternoon, and march eastward, as though preparing to intercept Kerboga. Then, under cover of darkness, the Crusaders would quietly return to the western side of the city, carrying ladders to scale the walls near Pyrrhus' post. As a sign of good faith, Pyrrhus promised to send his son as a hostage that evening. Bohemond accepted the plan. As evening approached, he instructed a foot soldier named Male Kuran to pass through the camp as a herald, announcing that the army would depart at sunset for a raid into enemy-held territory. He then summoned the leading princes and, for the first time, revealed his secret plan. Tonight, Bohemond declared, "If God is with us, Antioch will be ours." If Raymond harbored any jealousy, he kept it to himself. He and the others pledged their full support to the operation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Crusader army set off toward the east. The cavalry rode through the valley in front of Antioch, while the infantry trudged along the hill paths behind. Inside the city, the Turks watched their departure and, expecting an uneventful night, lowered their guard. But around midnight, orders were quietly issued for the entire army to reverse course and move toward the western and northwestern walls. Just before dawn, Bohemond's men reached the Tower of the Two Sisters. A ladder was propped against the wall, and 60 knights began climbing, led by Fulk of Chartres. One by one, they scaled the tower and slipped through a high window into a chamber where Pyrrhus nervously waited. Seeing how few had arrived, he exclaimed in Greek, "So few Franks! Where is Bohemond?" But his concern was premature. From the Tower of the Two Sisters, the knights quickly secured 2 adjacent towers also under Pyrrhus' command, allowing more ladders to be raised along the intervening wall sections. Meanwhile, an Italian foot soldier ran to inform Bohemond that it was time to enter the city. Though the ladder broke behind him, Bohemond managed to climb up. Some of the Crusaders raced along the ramparts, surprising the guards at their posts, while others descended into the streets to rally the Christian population. With their help, they opened both the gate of St. George and the large bridge gate, through which the bulk of the army was waiting to flood in. The Crusaders now poured into Antioch with minimal resistance. Greeks and Armenians joined them in slaughtering the Turks they encountered, including Firas's own brother. Amid the chaos, some Christians were also accidentally killed. Yaghi-Siyan, awakened by the tumult, quickly realized that the city was lost. With his bodyguard, he fled on horseback through the gorge toward the Iron Gate and out into the hills. His son, Shams ad-Dawla, however, remained composed. He rallied a group of men and reached the citadel before the Franks could intercept him. Bohemond gave chase, but was unable to breach the stronghold, so he hoisted his purple banner atop the highest point he could reach. Its appearance in the morning sunlight uplifted the spirits of the Crusaders still streaming into the city below. Once he had gathered enough men, Bohemond launched a direct assault on the citadel, but it failed, and he was wounded in the process. Many of his troops abandoned the effort, turning instead to looting the city. Bohemond was soon presented with the head of Yaghi-Siyan, delivered by an Armenian peasant. The Turkish commander had been thrown from his horse along a mountain path, abandoned by his escort, and left dazed and defenseless. A group of Armenians found and recognized him. They killed him immediately. One brought Bohemond his head and received a generous reward, while others sold his ornate belt and scimitar sheath for 60 bezants each. By the evening of June 3rd, no Turk remained alive in Antioch. Even Turks in nearby villages, untouched by the Crusaders, had fled in fear, seeking refuge with Kerboga. The homes of both Muslim and Christian residents were ransacked. Treasures and weapons were looted or recklessly destroyed. The streets were littered with rapidly decaying bodies, victims of the massacre and the scorching summer heat. Yet, despite the bloodshed and devastation, Antioch was once again in Christian hands.